Internet can't decide if Final Fantasy 16 sales are a success or flop. I was going to watch this. Here we go.
Final Fantasy is without question Square Enix's biggest franchise. It is their flagship IP, and so sales figures surrounding this franchise will absolutely matter for the company. They want to see Final Fantasy grow as a brand.
Yeah.
They are hoping that every new game exceeds in sales from the previous one, so that the franchise can continue to grow for long-term prospects.
Well, it's also like Final Fantasy is a loss leader for Square Enix's fuck-ups, right? Because Square Enix goes and they have like some fucking NFT game. They have that Avengers bullshit. Nobody cares because Final Fantasy is good. And that's what they need. So they need to make sure that Final Fantasy is good. If it's bad, oop, that's it. Forspoken, yep, doesn't matter because Final Fantasy. Yeah, it is their loss leader.
Or what is such an iconic series in the landscape of gaming. Now, there's been some debate as to how well Final Fantasy 16 was going to sell and is selling currently. Critical reception-wise, the game's doing really well. I mean, generally, it's been received really positively among both critics and players alike. But there were early indications that Square Enix might be worried about how well this game is going to sell. So right here is Imran Khan's Patreon. And scrolling down, you'll find this excerpt where he said that I'd heard...
I feel like you can only really compare Final Fantasy sales with other sales of PS5 games. Because that's what I would compare it to, because a lot of people don't have a PS5. That's a big thing. Like, how many of you guys, like, for the longest time, you couldn't buy a PS5?
Recently that Square Enix is panicking slightly over Final Fantasy 16 pre-order numbers, which are tracking behind Final Fantasy 15, even accounting for the lesser number of launching platforms.
Bro, like, it's not about launching platforms. Didn't Final Fantasy 15 come out on PS5 towards, like, the middle or end of the life cycle of PS4? Towards the middle or end of the life cycle of PS4? And also, PS4 was comparatively a much higher value console. Like, PS4, I think, was just undoubtedly the best console in that whole thing. And, like, there's so much more context to that, too. Like, PS4, like, Sony made some, like, major PR moves because Xbox tried to do these things with, like, they were, like, super consumer unfriendly, like, not letting people, like, resell games, like, making the Xbox always have your camera on, always be connected to the internet. And, like, Sony said, fuck that, we're not doing that. And, like, for me, that made me buy a fucking PlayStation, not an Xbox, because I said, yo, like, of course. Now, Xbox had to walk all that back because of the market, but the truth is that probably caused so many more people to buy a PS4. And it's not just that, right? It's the fact that PS4 had way better exclusives, it had way better content, and I think the console is just straight up better than the Xbox One. So it makes sense that a game, it's just like, bro, it's, you know, bigger pond, more fish. There it is.
Now, this was before the game's launch. This was even before the Final Fantasy 16 demo came out. That demo impressed a lot of people, and I think a lot of people pre-ordered the game because of that demo. And eventually, you know, Final Fantasy 16, the Twitter page here and on social media was announced that the game had sold and shipped and digitally sold 3 million copies of Final Fantasy 16 on PlayStation 5, which is a pretty impressive sales figure when you consider that this is not a multi-platform game. It's just a PS5 exclusive. So these are pretty impressive figures overall. Given the circumstances, we're talking about an install base of roughly 40 million PlayStation 5 users, and for
strong PS5 hardware sales goes out. How many? Let me see how many PS4 have been sold. Yo, look at this, 117 million. Look at this. So it is literally 3x. So PS4 was 3x. That's high as fuck. Yeah.
3 million Final Fantasy 15 copies to be sold among this player base, like, that's not bad at all. And if we look at how this game sales compare to other titles, especially those PlayStation exclusives like God of War and Last of Us and Final Fantasy VII Remake and Spider-Man, some of these which were across generation, you can see that Final Fantasy 16, you know, holds up. It is in the top 10 list, and it is the fastest selling PlayStation 5 exclusive ever, meaning no cross-gen, just PlayStation 5. So far, so good, right? While there are other analysts who are suggesting that Final Fantasy 16 sales might not be going according to Square Enix's plans, it's one thing to just look at raw numbers. It's another thing to look at what Square Enix was expecting, especially when it comes to the homeland of Japan, where sales tumbled quite a bit. This is Takahashi Mochizuki's analysis of this situation. He tweeted out, as expected, Final Fantasy XVI second week sales tumbled in Japan. It will be difficult to sell more without a deep price cut, Toyo Securities Yasuda says. Note that Takahashi Mochizuki is specifically looking at Japan, where a significant portion of Final Fantasy sales happen. He further commented by saying that some say Final Fantasy XVI.
I wonder if the people that live in Japan were unhappy about Final Fantasy 16 and the fact that the lip syncing was tied to the didn't they say that it was tied to the English rather than the Japanese? And I wonder how people in Japan took that, because I know that like a lot of other countries are much more nationalistic and they take things much more personally. They don't care about that, because I remember like hearing the weird thing with like Korea and China. They don't care? Okay, I'm wrong. I was just curious.
I don't know. Sales are due to elements out of Square Enix's control. No, it wasn't. It was Square Enix that decided to launch the game on PS5 only on June 22nd at $70. No one else is. So he's adamant that if you look at raw numbers, that Final Fantasy 16 sales just aren't as good as they could be, with choices like PS5 exclusivity and launching during the busy period of June being contributing factors. And he provided figures for what physical sales look like for the game in Japan. Recent Final Fantasy sales in Japan, launch week to second week, excluding download sales. So again, physical only. So there's a comparison. Final Fantasy 16 in 2023, 336,027 units sold in the first week. And then in the second week, that dropped to 37,763 units. Physical units, that dropped.
Launch week to second week. So this is like the total amount sold, excluding download sales. Like, okay, so like this is the thing, right? Is like in 2016, you could expect to see more people that were buying like a physical copy. But I don't think you can really make a very strong correlation, like a 2x correlation of like 2020 downloads versus 2023. Because I feel like 2020, people were still doing downloads like digitally all the time, even then. Like it was extremely common. But in 2016, maybe not as many people were doing them. So I think Final Fantasy VII, again, post-COVID, yeah, I think a lot of people are probably doing that. Sure. You now have digital-only consoles? Yeah, I know there's Copium. Well, I mean, like, I didn't finish the analysis. I think it's obvious Final Fantasy 16 didn't sell as well as Final Fantasy 7. Final Fantasy 7 is by far the most famous Final Fantasy, and everybody knows Cloud, everybody knows Tifa, everybody knows Sephiroth. Like, that's the main game, right? Like, that's it. That's like saying, like, Super Mario 64 is the most popular Mario, probably, right? Or Super Mario World. Only Tifa. Yeah, sure. So I think that it makes sense because Final Fantasy VII just has like I know all the characters in that game. I didn't even play it.
Up to 37,763 units, physical units again, but it's more.
Do you all think that Final Fantasy 15 did damage to the brand? Because a lot of people really didn't like Final Fantasy 15. Yes. Yeah, I think that it could be like a Shadowlands Dragonflight situation, like in WoW, where like Dragonflight is a better expansion, but people are just unhappy with the previous one, so they don't want to buy the new one. Maybe, I don't know.
More about looking at the percentage of drop when it comes to sales, and that likely isn't going to be too far off for digital sales either. Now, here's the thing: if you look at the drop off from first week to second week sales of other major Final Fantasy releases like the Final Fantasy VII Remake and Final Fantasy 15, in terms of percentage, it's in line with what Final Fantasy 16 is showing here. The second week was about 10% of the sales that the first week was across the board for all three of these games. Now, there's something to consider about Japan specifically. Xbox does not sell in Japan. Xbox is almost like a null factor. It's almost something you don't take into consideration when it comes to something like Final Fantasy 15, which did launch multi-platform on Xbox and PlayStation. But if you look at just Japan specifically, you might as well not count Xbox sales because they're so minimal that it might as well not contribute to these figures.
That makes sense, sure. Like, I don't know what the numbers on that are, but it makes sense.
So if you look at it from the perspective of PS4 versus PS5 sales, Final Fantasy 16 sold about half of what Final Fantasy 15 did, but in terms of PS4 versus PS5 numbers during their respective launches, we're not talking about a 50% difference in console numbers. In Japan, PS5 numbers at the time of Final Fantasy 16's launch are around 10% behind PlayStation 4 at the time of Final Fantasy 15's launch, and yet Final Fantasy 16
let me read that again.
behind PlayStation 4.
MC data 2016, take December 2016 data. Oh, so he accounted for PS5 and PS4 sales. Oh, okay, that's good. That's good. So even whenever you account for the difference in sales of PS5s, it's 10% less. It's still massively below. It's not a good argument, in my opinion, because PS5 is not in shortage anymore. It's like 6 months. Well, I mean, it doesn't, like, he literally, even if it was a good argument, he accounted for it, and it's that differential it's defined, and it doesn't make up the difference.
At the time of Final Fantasy 15's launch, and yet Final Fantasy 16 sales in Japan are half that of Final Fantasy 15.
And somebody also brought up a good point in chat, is that 7 also sold in 2020, which was during COVID.
Despite the 10% difference in the install base of PS4 versus PS5. So while internationally the game has sold 3 million units, in Japan, things are a little rough. You can tell that Final Fantasy XVI's shift in style to something more action-oriented with RPG elements taking a backseat did have an impact on Japanese players' perception of the game and whether it's a game that appealed to them. It might have isolated some, fans and players.
Yeah, I'm actually really curious to hear what Japanese players actually think about it.
Who are expecting Final Fantasy to be more of that, traditional
15
RPG. I think Square Enix was hoping that in Japan, numbers would be comparable enough to Final Fantasy 15 that sales across the board would exceed a little more than 3 million, a couple 100,000 more copies beyond that. But sales are just proving to be weaker on the Japan side of things, even if overall, when you consider the circumstances, the exclusivity of Final Fantasy 16, 3 million units is pretty freaking good. You know what else is pretty freaking good? The sponsor of today's video, Skillshare, a platform dedicated to forging a community of experts and learners. As a content creator, voice actor, and artist with myriad pursuits, the ability to
Speaking of that voice actor, Young actually got a important role in one of the new, I think it's one of the new Yakuza games. Like, he actually got a huge role in that, in like a new game. Kiyu? I don't have to say his name, but yeah.
Access useful classes to accelerate my proficiency with certain key skills
is
really important.
Really?
And Skillshare has been a really convenient hub for me to absorb that type of knowledge.
He's the main character?
For example, I've wanted to expand my expertise with creative digital programs like Adobe Photoshop and After Effects, get better at vocal techniques like singing, and even learn instruments like the guitar. And there's so many great classes that are readily accessible here for these disciplines. There seems to be a class for just about anyone and anything, and the video classes I've discovered have all been pretty useful and have genuinely enhanced my progress in developing my desired skills. Beyond that, Skillshare also features classes that help optimize general aspects of your career, including classes that guide you on how to find confidence in your creativity, how to become more productive and better at time management, or how to start a business. It's a genuinely useful library of knowledge and insight that could develop your skills and help propel your career no matter what your goals and aspirations are. And by using my link, the first 1,000 people to join will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare that will allow you to give it a test drive. You'll find my link in the description box and comment section below if you want to take advantage of this offer. Now, zooming out and looking at the international picture of Final Fantasy 16 sales, this is William R. Aguilar, who posted this whole analysis that he did. He broke this down in a way that, does paint a picture when it comes to Final Fantasy 16's trend and how, when you look at things internationally and not just the Japanese market, it's doing about as well, if not better, than Final Fantasy 15. So he broke it down as follows. The sales of Final Fantasy 15 were 80% on PlayStation 4, 11% on PC, and 9% on Xbox One.
So it was like even Final Fantasy 6 or 15 was pretty much all PS4.
In its first week, FF15 sold 5 million copies worldwide. Final Fantasy 15 did eventually sell 10 million copies, but that took 6 years for it.
Final Fantasy 15 sold 5 million copies, and so you take 20% away from that, so that's obviously going to be 4 million. So even in the context of this, Final Fantasy 16 undersold Final Fantasy 15 by about 25%. If you compare only PlayStation to PlayStation, and you could take that 10%, you could take that 25%, reduce it a little bit because of the of like how much fewer people have a PlayStation 5. So like if it's a 10% differential in the lifespan of the console, then it would be somewhere around 22% or 20%.
Happen. We'll see how long it takes for a Final Fantasy 16 to reach
maybe
those
not
sales
that low.
figures. I imagine that once FF16's timed exclusivity ends and it comes out on other platforms like PC and Xbox, that'll accelerate FF16's ability to reach that coveted 10 million units sold mark. Whether at a faster rate than Final Fantasy 15, well, that remains to be seen. But
I think that it probably will over time, maybe. I think so, but it depends.
Final Fantasy 16, being an exclusive title to PlayStation 5, sold 3 million units in 1 week. And so when you look at the overall install base of those respective games, again, outside of Japan, where Xbox does play a factor, now we're looking at a situation where if you combine the total install base of PlayStation 4 users and Xbox One users worldwide and just how many more players had access to Final Fantasy 15 and compare that to just how significantly fewer PlayStation 5s are out there at the time of Final Fantasy 16's launch, then suddenly Final Fantasy 16's international sales start to look pretty decent. In a follow-up addendum tweet, William R. Aguilar broke things down as follows. So for Final Fantasy 15, 80% of the 5 million units that were sold on the first week were sold on PlayStation 5. So that's 4 million units sold on PlayStation 4 and its install base at the time. PS4 sold after Black Friday was 53 million units, which is significantly higher than the 39 million or the roughly 40 million PlayStation 5s install base right now.
Oh, I really like this. So he's using the percentage of people who owned a PlayStation and what percentage of them actually purchased the game.
Now, so when it comes
you
to
see
like
kind of like what he's doing here is he's showing like it's 4 million out of 53 million. And then there's 39 million PS5s and there's 3 million. Yeah, that's actually really good math. That's better than what I did.
PlayStation 5's install base right now. So
it's actually better.
To like attach rate of the number of consoles versus how many people who own that console bought the game, 7.5% of the PlayStation 4 install base bought Final Fantasy 15, whereas roughly 7.7% of the PlayStation 5 install base bought Final Fantasy 16. So when you look at it in that perspective, zoom out of Japan and look at how overall sales are doing.
So it sold the same.
Final Fantasy 16 is tracking pretty well overall. Though if Japan had performed roughly as well as Final Fantasy 15 did, sales could have been even greater.
Better,
and there are plenty of other comparisons that are being made to highlight that Final Fantasy 16 selling 3 million copies in the first week as a PlayStation 5 exclusive is pretty impressive. Here's Derek, who said that Modern Warfare 2 sold 4.4 million.
I mean, Modern Warfare 2 is Modern Warfare 2. I mean, like, that's just... It's hard to beat Modern Warfare 2, man.
Copies in its first week on PlayStation alone, but this includes PS4 and PS5 sales. This was a cross-gen title, and Final Fantasy 16 got pretty decently close to that with just PlayStation 5 exclusivity sales. Others are saying that the perspective seems to be skewed when it comes to Final Fantasy 16 sales, that people seem to be much more strict with Final Fantasy 16 sales figures and quicker to call it a flop compared to other games.
I don't get that. I feel like people are so attached to like the sales of Final Fantasy 16. Like, people really care about this a lot. That's why I wanted to watch this video, because like, I mean, to me, like, I've only played Final Fantasy 14 besides 16. I've enjoyed the game. I think the game's good. Like, I would rate the game a 9.5. And I think probably one more, just based off of like what I think is going to happen in this story, I have one more stream left until I finish it.
Consider that Street Fighter 6, which was reviewed very well and which many players are partaking in, has sold over 2 million copies within its first week. Final Fantasy 16 managed to sell.
No, I'm amazed that people play. Like, it's so crazy for me to see that many people like play Street Fighter. Because like I don't give a fuck about Street Fighter, but like it's massively popular.
Million copies within its first week.
It's the same as like sports
and keep in
games.
mind that Street Fighter 6 is multi-platform. It did come out on Xbox, PlayStation, and PC. Final Fantasy 16 came out just on PlayStation 5, and it outsold Street Fighter by 1 million. All things said and done, things could be worse for Final Fantasy 16.
They could.
Now, going back to the Japanese side of things, here is Genki, who addressed the situation in Japan, tweeting that Final Fantasy 16 sales in Japan are weaker than Final Fantasy 15 due to the current state of the PS market in Japan and the game catering more to Western audiences.
How does the game cater more towards Western audiences? Do you guys know? Because I'd be curious to know like how much different is it because there's not a lot of RPG stuff in it or what? Action combat, it's not turn-based. So even in the setting, it's not anime enough? I don't know. Did you play it? Yeah, I don't know about that. You play JRPG, you know? Yeah, I guess because like I haven't played any other game, so I'm not sure. Setting, faces being more Caucasian and Asian overall, and the priority on the English setting. Yeah, and I think like obviously... a lot of like they talked about Game of Thrones themselves, right? So like Game of Thrones is an American show, and I'm sure maybe it was popular in Japan, but it was probably a lot more popular here. So like maybe that's another reason. The setting is subjective though. Well, no, but like I think it would still make sense that a setting that is based off of European medieval fantasy would not sell as well to a Japanese audience. I don't know, maybe that's not true, but like that's what I would guess.
More action-oriented combat and aspects of the setting and the vibe and the more Game of Thronesy aspect to it. Maybe that stuff just alienated some users, some players, some fans in Japan. I think it's safe to say that in Japan these are very tough results, and that Final Fantasy 16 did leave some consumers behind. It's too far from the past Final Fantasy. The identity of it just wasn't something that maybe appealed to Japanese audiences as much. But 3 million units sold worldwide for a PS5 exclusive is not weak sales overall, and this is the stance that I agree with. Things could have been better in Japan, but with all things said and done, I don't know how you can call 3 million units as a PlayStation 5 exclusive sold within the first week a flop. Now, it's one thing to look at raw numbers, and it's another thing to look at what Square Enix expected. Just because these are good numbers when you consider, the circumstances of Final Fantasy 16 and the exclusivity and all those things, doesn't mean necessarily that it reached Square Enix's expectations for how much money this game needed to make back its production costs, make back its marketing costs, and to meet certain financial quotas that they were hoping to meet before their next financial briefing. Like,
that's definitely probably true that they spent probably a lot of money on Final Fantasy 16. Like they've spent, like from my perspective, like, they have like a S-tier team making it. Everything about the game was like really, really, really good. They fucking invested a lot into it. So I could see how even equivalent sales wouldn't be fulfilling.
That's really what defines how successful this game is, in the eyes of Square Enix. It's worth noting that Square Enix does have a track record of setting sales expectations way too high and just being unrealistic with that kind of stuff. So I'm wondering if this is a similar scenario where even if these numbers are actually pretty good, they set their goals so high and the budget got so bloated that even if Final Fantasy 16 does impressive numbers, unless it becomes a Tears of the Kingdom level or Elden Ring level type of mega hit, it's not going to make Square Enix the money that they would have liked this game to make, given the investment of time and manpower and resources. And Square Enix specifically and the executives, they are looking at Final Fantasy 16 as a potential, not necessarily flop, but not a resounding success that they were hoping Final Fantasy 16 would be with its change in direction. There have been situations in the past where a game was a sales success, but a corporate flop, if you know my meaning. And so I guess time will tell how Square Enix presents the circumstances, whether in their next financial briefing, they'll...
Yeah, because they're going to, like, you have to say, like, I think that they'll, yeah, I'm not sure. Taking into account Japan couldn't get a PS5 until like 2 or 3 months. Yeah, but he already accounted for that in like his numbers for Japanese owners of PlayStations in like the numbers that he showed. That was already considered. Released it on different platforms. I could see, the thing is that I think Final Fantasy, and like this is, I don't really know this, but from like what I've seen, it seems like Final Fantasy 16 probably has a lot more replay value than like 15, for example. I never see anybody playing Final Fantasy 15. I don't think anybody gives a fuck. But people will come back. Like I see all the time on like my recommended videos, and like yeah, I click a few of them, so that's why I see them. But I see a lot of them with a good amount of views that have they're about like Devil May Cry. Or like now I'm getting recommended, you know, some guy doing like a no-hit run of like the hard mode version of a boss in Final Fantasy 16. So I could see it having like more of a residual audience over time than 15 did. But yeah, it could just be YouTube algorithm, and you know, I also don't really consume content of Final Fantasy 15, so I could be wrong off of that.
Say, you know, this exceeded our expectations, or this met our expectations, and we're in a really good place.
Like,
and we're happy with this.
I just don't have enough knowledge
or if
about
they'll end
this
up saying, "Oof, man, we were hoping that we could recoup more of the costs. We were hoping for more of a profit margin and more revenue than what yielded." In Japan, the game didn't perform as well. How much of an impact did that have on the game meeting the corporate sales expectations and quotas? Those are the questions that we still don't have answers to, and that's ultimately what will define if the people who made this game, the company that invested in making this product, deemed this a successful product. So we'll see how that pans out. Only time will tell. Square Enix will have to tell their investors at one point just, you know, what their perspective is on all of this. Until then, though, let me know in the comments below what your thoughts and opinions are on Final Fantasy 16 selling 3 million units overall internationally within its first week of being released exclusively on PlayStation 5, and then the data with Japan, and whether you think Square Enix will ultimately be happy with the current results, or whether you think Square Enix will have set the expectations too high and that they'll ultimately share like disappointing results, or will say that the results were disappointing based on their expectations. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.
All right. So, just put it on PC, everything will be fine. Well, you can say just put it on PC and everything will be fine. But like I don't think that's true, because if you look at the PC sales for 15, it was only 11% on PC. So here's the video. Make sure to give it a like. I think this is a good one. I'm glad to see this. I'm disappointed that you know, people are so like attached to this, but yeah. 15 sucked though. Well, if 15 suck, then we're not talking about a number. We're talking about a percentage. 15 didn't launch on PC. Oh, so you're saying that that's actually a really good point. So you're saying that because 15 got a bad reception and then it released on PC later, that it affected the sales. That's a good point. Yeah, that's actually a good point. Whereas like Final Fantasy 16 has had a good reception, and I don't think, yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense, what you're saying. I agree with that. I didn't know that. 15 was exclusive too? Yeah, at the beginning. But, like, the thing is that I feel like people had a much better reception of Final Fantasy 16 than 15. Like, just based off of, it's again, vibe check, right? I could be wrong. Final Fantasy 16 has a mixed reception? Well, let me see. Well, I mean, Final Fantasy, it's lower. It's like 0.5 lower. That's kind of substantial, but like not huge. But yeah, I mean, that's 15. I know, but like they said that. It's 8.3. Yeah, see, I told you. Because he just showed it in the video. Let's see here. Look at Steam score for 15. Well, I don't need to, but like all I'm saying is that I hope that, yeah, I hope it does sell better. Like, I like the game. I think it's a good game. But, I mean, I also don't think the critics are wrong in that it doesn't have a lot of RPG elements, because that's true. It doesn't. Like, it's not like this is Elden Ring. And, like, I've never played another Final Fantasy game, so, like, I don't know the level of customization they usually have. But, like, it doesn't. The game is mid, to be honest. Good cinema, though. I think the actual combat of the game is really good. I like the actual combat of the game and the actual gameplay.